All right, my AP US history friends, I just want to do a quick review video on the concepts after the American Revolution. So we need to quickly look at the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, and then the presidencies of Washington and Adams. I'll try to do this as quick as I can because our Unit 3 test is coming up, and I just wanted to make sure I gave you the opportunity to see this all a second time. Anyways, starting out, why specifically do we need to create a new constitution? Well, we've already established the fact that the Americans are setting up their new government in the context of just dealing with the monarchy of England. Therefore, our first constitution, the Articles of Confederation, essentially has no executive power. There is a federal government, it does exist, but the ability to enforce laws, which is the job of the executive branch in the first place, really doesn't exist at all. Again, I know for sure there's a Unit 3 test question that's about why did the Americans set up their first constitution like this? The answer is, once again, they are still influenced by the British control of the colonies and a monarchy. So, some issues with the Articles of Confederation, why it needs to be replaced. First and foremost, we already talked about the lack of executive power. Secondly, the Articles of Confederation could not tax. There was no system by which the federal government could collect tax revenue without asking the states for it first. And obviously, the states are not going to give them the tax revenue. So, for example, the government in the Articles of Confederation has the ability to raise an army, but they can't raise it without tax revenue. So essentially making them useless, right? This becomes an issue, and really the ID term that comes up with why we need to replace the Articles of Confederation with Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts. Essentially, Daniel Shays has a rebellion against the Massachusetts banking system that wants to foreclose upon their farms in Massachusetts. And the state of Massachusetts is forced to put this rebellion down because there is no federal authority to raise an army and then, put it down. So that would be the ID term you would use, Shays' Rebellion. There's a series of compromises that are going to be on your Unit 3 test about the Constitution and the ratification of the Constitution. We established that there's going to be the ratification of the Constitution is the more important thing here for APUS. If you take like AP GoPo, they care more about what's in the Constitution itself. APUS cares more about the ratification of the Constitution. So the compromises that we're going to look at and between which groups, first of all, we're going to look at between the large states and the small states, and I mean that in terms of population. The Virginia plan, which is a large state plan, is to have representation in the legislature be determined by population, meaning that larger states by population would have more say in the lawmaking process. The small state plan, also known as the New Jersey plan, calls for equal representation of each of the states in Congress. This eventually is going to be known as the Senate, where each state gets two senators. So this debate goes on, and it eventually reached in what's known as the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise, where we create what is known as a bicameral legislature, which means two houses. So the Senate, again, is going to be for the New Jersey plan for the smaller states, two senators per state, giving equal representation there. The House of Representatives is going to be determined by population. That satisfies the larger states like Virginia. This also leads to another compromise known as the 3/5 compromise. Discussing on premise, we've already talked about this. Slavery isn't essentially an ethical argument just yet. The issue of slavery is a political and economic issue in the early part of the country, specifically looking at the political issue of representation in Congress. The South wants to claim their slaves as citizens, as a number to then get more representation in the House. This is obviously an issue because if you're saying that they are a person or a citizen, you are also implying that they either have rights now or at some point might be granted rights in the future, which is something the South does not want to do. But obviously still wants that representation in the House. So they come to a compromise with the North where they're going to count slaves as 3/5 of a person. Within that compromise, as well as the end of the slave trade, it's going to end in 1808, and that deal gets done. As disgusting as it is to call anybody 3/5 of a person, remember, this is a political issue at this point. Moving forward, we have two groups, so that's another compromise between slave states and free states. So far, we've done two. The third compromise is going to be between the factions of political parties that exist in the country at the time, with the Federalists that enjoy stronger federal power. I think that might be obvious. And the Anti-Federalists, who, don't like strong federal power. It's almost in the names, my friends, right? So, anyways, the Federalists want the states to ratify the Constitution, They, in fact, even write a series of papers making an argument called the Federalist Papers that we should ratify the Constitution. However, the Anti Federalists, and specifically on your Unit 3 test, there's a quote from the governor of Massachusetts, Elbridge Gerry, in which he outlines that in order for the Anti Federalist states to be satisfied, they need to add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution. So basically, the trade is between the Federalists and the Anti Federalists. The Anti Federalists are going to get the Bill of Rights, the Federalists are going to get the Constitution ratified. Then just some background on like the actual things I'm going to need you to know moving forward about the Constitution, like checks and balances between the different branches, what the different branches do, what popular sovereignty is, some of the amendments I'm going to care about moving forward, but most importantly, Whiskey Rebellion, which comes up on your notes, so I'm going to save it for that. There's also some common AP questions at the bottom for you, so hopefully we're going to take a look at those in class anyways, but those would help you to look through on your Unit 3 test as well. Moving on to what I covered today, the Washington and Adams' presidencies. So after the Articles of Confederation are thrown away and after the Constitution is written, it sets up a system by which we are going to have an executive. The obvious choice in this situation is General George Washington. He is incredibly popular within the country and is in fact still today the only president that is unanimously elected by the Electoral College. We said as a side fact that might be a good extra credit question. Two other presidents have come close. They've won 49 states, President Reagan and President Nixon in 1972. Each win 49 states, pretty close in that way. But some of the reasons, we really care about Washington's presidency as a whole, this seems quite obvious. But Washington, one of his biggest, additions or positive steps here is the fact that he does eventually give up power. He serves a two 4-year terms, and at the end of which he gives up power, right? Which, is going to be a big thing moving forward. Right. So other things, right, that Washington is going to establish for us is creating a cabinet, how to address the president, things like that. I don't particularly care about for your test. Things that I do care about is using force to enforce the law. He is the commander in chief, Washington, and he's going to set the precedent moving forward that the federal government has the ability to to use federal law as the commander-in-chief, to use the army to enforce law, and that's going to be seen in the Whiskey Rebellion. That's a specific piece of evidence proving that the Constitution is strong, right? We already looked a little bit at the cabinet. We already covered Hamilton's financial plan as well in a previous document in class, but we'll just go through it really quick. Really, the two parts I care about the most is that Hamilton creates a national bank and consolidates the state debt. This is going to be important for establishing the financial system of the U.S. By the way, maybe another good extra credit question. He uses the argument of the necessary and proper clause, that the government can do what is necessary and proper for it to fulfill its duties. And part of that is creating a national bank. A big debate's going to be moving forward are like, what does the federal government actually have the power to do versus the states, and what's constitutional and what's unconstitutional. Part of this, by the way, is going to be a tax on whiskey, which is then going to lead to the Whiskey Rebellion, which Washington puts down. Obviously, people who are opponents to Hamilton's plan, Hamilton's a big federalist. He also is giving the federal government a lot of power in this by giving them a Bank of the U.S. So the southern states, who are mostly anti-federalists, have a problem with this, so they reach a compromise as well. This is separate from the Constitution. Do not put the Compromise of 1790 in the ratification of the Constitution part. This is completely different. The trade here is the national debt will be established by accepting Hamilton's financial plan and creating the Bank of the United States. In exchange, the South gets the capital of the U.S. located in Washington, D.C., or in the South. All right, we already talked about the Whiskey Rebellion, so we're not going to spend too much time here. But again, the two most important parts is it shows that there's executive power in the Constitution. It sets the precedent that the federal government will enforce federal law by any means necessary. Makes the states follow law. Washington is also very much into his proclamation of neutrality. This idea that America needs to stay neutral on European affairs, especially as an early country, because the French Revolution is going to start, and it has a bunch of ramifications moving forward. Part of Washington wanting to be neutral is he signs Jay's Treaty, which is a treaty with England. It really does annoy France, but there are still some English citizens and some English government presence on the North American continent. So essentially, the U.S. makes a deal with England so that England recognizes the U.S. as neutral. It's called Jay's Treaty. There's also one with Spain called Pinckney's Treaty. Jay's Treaty is definitely the more important one because, one, it pisses off France, but two, it proves Washington's neutrality. If I asked you to give me a specific evidence of of Washington's neutrality, you would tell me Jay's treaty. All right. Anyways, Washington's farewell address, he's going to outline the fact that the U.S. needs to be neutral, but he also outlines the fact that he thinks political parties are bad for the future of the country. He probably got that one right. Um, Speaking of the growth of political parties, the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists, we already know a lot about them. I know it says Democratic Republicans on that slide. They do eventually change their name, but that's at the beginning of Unit 4. So for now, let's just focus on Federalists versus Anti-Federalists, right? It makes sense that the Federalists would support the British because they're about stronger central government. So is the Federalist Party. It makes sense that the Anti-Federalists, or the Democratic Republicans, would be pro-French because the French are having a revolution and they're trying to overthrow their monarchy. So that would make sense. We have the election of 1796. All right, Washington decides to leave. He could have kept running for more terms if he wanted to, but decided not to, again, setting that precedent. So Adams takes over as president, who unfortunately gets a D minus grade for me. Washington gets an A, mostly because he didn't become dictator, right? But Adams comes into the presidency dealing with the issues with France being upset with the U.S. Because France upset with the U.S., they start doing what's known as impressment, or capturing ships and forcing them into service. So this is really going to annoy the Americans because the French are not respecting America as this neutral power. So what Adams decides to do is send ambassadors over to France to convince the French to stop this impressment, right? It's called the XYZ affair. Basically, the French end up asking for a bribe, as you can see in this political cartoon, and this shows a lot of disrespect to the Americans. Adams does not want to reveal the names of the ambassadors, to save them embarrassment, so he calls them Ambassador X, Ambassador Y, and Ambassador Z, right? This then leads to, by the way, Adams passing the Alien and Sedition Acts. These are definitely like the death nail of Adams' reputation and his presidency. So I care more about the Sedition Acts, but really quick, the Alien Acts basically says you have the ability to deport undesirable immigrants into the country. He means the French, and it also becomes more difficult to become an American citizen. The Sedition Acts I care about because you basically can't talk smack about the U.S. government. Libel is essentially what that means. You can't, be in the press or in the general public talking smack about the U.S. government or its actions. This is really going to piss people off because we just passed the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment. So the Anti-Federalists are going to be like, what the hell, John? We just totally had a compromise with you where we put the Bill of Rights in there and you're already breaking it as president. You can see the political cartoon that's like the snake that is the Sedition Acts, attacking honest opinion, free speech, and free press, the little kids there. Last slide. Because the Anti-Federalists, which are mostly located in the South, the southern states, right, are upset with the Sedition Acts, they pass the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. This basically says that states have the ability to nullify federal law. Spoiler alert, they don't. States have to follow federal law. We already saw that with the Whiskey Rebellion. This is just another example of states saying they don't have to follow federal law. And there's eventually going to be a whole war between whether or not states have to follow federal law, specifically the federal law that you can't own slaves anymore. So this ends up being a big deal long term. Anyways, I think I'm all set. I think that's all I need to do. If you have any questions, let me know.